If you thought the bear roadblock in Yellowstone was dramatic, wait until you hear what happened just minutes after the cameras stopped rolling. This next part is even more unbelievable. While everyone was celebrating what seemed like the end of our incredible encounter with that protective mother bear and her cubs, nature had one more twist waiting for us. One more heart-stopping moment that would test every ounce of courage Mike had left in him. You see, what we didn't show you in that last video, what we couldn't capture in those final moments, was the sound that made everyone's blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost lost in the excitement of watching the bear family disappear into the forest. But Mike heard it, that desperate, high-pitched crying that every parent, human or animal, recognizes instantly, the sound of a baby in distress. As the crowd of tourists began to disperse, engines starting up, people sharing their excitement about what they'd just witnessed, Mike stood frozen in the middle of that snow-covered road. His experienced ears had picked up something that would change everything, something that would turn their incredible wildlife encounter into a life-or-death rescue mission. The temperature was dropping fast. The snow was getting heavier. Most people were eager to get back to their warm cars and continue their Yellowstone adventure. But that sound, that desperate crying, it was getting weaker, more urgent, more heartbreaking. And it was coming from somewhere none of them expected. Mike's eyes darted around the scene, trying to locate the source of that cry. The other tourists were oblivious, still buzzing with adrenaline from their close encounter with the bears. Some were already posting videos on social media. Others were calling friends and family to share their incredible story. But Mike knew something was terribly wrong. That's when he saw her. The mother bear, standing at the edge of the tree line, not moving away like her other cubs. She was looking back, pacing frantically, making low, anxious sounds that only a parent in distress makes. Her massive head kept turning toward the road, toward that drainage ditch that ran alongside the asphalt. The same ditch that had been covered by snow and ignored by everyone focused on the dramatic standoff they'd just witnessed. The crying was coming from down there, from that dark, cold space beneath the road where the snow had created a perfect trap. One of her cubs had fallen through, and now it was stuck, scared and slowly losing the strength to keep calling for help. The temperature was dropping below freezing, and time was running out fast. What happened next would test every limit of human courage and compassion. It would push Mike beyond anything he'd ever experienced in his years of wildlife photography, and it would create a moment so powerful, so emotionally charged, that everyone who witnessed it would never forget what they saw that day in Yellowstone. Let me take you back to those final seconds of our last encounter. The tension in the air was electric. We'd just witnessed something incredible. That massive mother bear finally deciding we weren't a threat to her family. Her cubs had been playing in the snow just yards from a line of stopped cars, tourists holding their breath, cameras rolling, everyone mesmerized by this rare glimpse into the wild heart of Yellowstone. Mike had been the calm presence in that chaos, the one person who understood bear behavior well enough to keep everyone safe. His quiet confidence had guided us through those intense minutes when one wrong move could have turned magical into tragic. The mother bear had finally gathered her cubs, or so we thought, and melted back into the pine forest like shadows disappearing at dawn. The road was chaos. Cars parked at odd angles, hazard lights blinking through the falling snow, excited voices mixing with the sound of engines warming up. The temperature was plummeting fast, and everyone was eager to get moving again. Steam rose from exhaust pipes into the frigid air, creating an almost mystical atmosphere in the fading daylight. But that sound changed everything. That weak, desperate crying that cut through all the human excitement like a knife through silk. Mike's head snapped up instantly. His photographer's instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, immediately alert. While everyone else was caught up in the euphoria of their incredible encounter, he was listening to something that made his heart sink. The mother bear's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. She hadn't been leading her family away in triumph. She'd been frantically searching, pacing, calling out in the low, urgent tones that animals use when their babies are in danger. One of her cubs was missing, and she knew exactly where it was. The drainage culvert ran beneath the road, designed to channel snowmelt and rainwater safely under the asphalt. It was about 3 feet in diameter, dark, cold, and now partially filled with snow and ice. Somehow, in all the excitement and movement, one of the cubs had fallen through a weak spot in the snow cover and tumbled down into that concrete tube. Mike knelt at the edge of the road, his trained ear following that heartbreaking sound. The crying was getting weaker, more desperate. The cub was trapped, probably scared out of its mind, and the temperature was dropping fast. In weather like this, a young bear separated from its mother and trapped in a cold, wet space wouldn't survive long. The other tourists were starting to notice something was wrong. A few people stopped packing up their cameras, sensing the shift in Mike's demeanor. The celebration was fading, replaced by a growing sense of urgency that spread through the crowd like wildfire. If real, emotional animal rescue stories like this touch your heart, now's the perfect moment to join our community. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us for more moments like this, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in the incredible bond between humans and wildlife. The mother bear was becoming increasingly agitated. She kept approaching the road, then backing away, her massive frame tense with anxiety. Every maternal instinct was screaming at her to help her baby, but the presence of so many humans was creating an impossible dilemma. She was trapped between her fear of people and her desperate need to save her cub. Mike understood the situation immediately. This wasn't just about a trapped animal anymore. This was about a mother's love, about the universal bond between parent and child that transcends species. The same love that makes human parents lift cars off their children was driving this 800-pound bear to the edge of what her instincts would allow. The snow was getting heavier, the wind picking up, and the daylight was fading fast. Time was running out for the trapped cub, and everyone could feel it. The crying from the culvert was becoming more intermittent, weaker, as the little bear's strength began to fail. Some tourists were starting to get back in their cars, either not understanding the gravity of the situation or feeling helpless to do anything about it. Others stayed, drawn by some primal recognition of the drama unfolding before them. This was nature at its most raw, most emotional, most desperately real. Mike stood at the crossroads of an impossible decision. Every fiber of his being wanted to help, but approaching a trapped cub with its mother nearby went against every rule of wildlife safety he'd ever learned. Mother bears defending their young were among the most dangerous animals on Earth, capable of incredible speed and devastating power. But that crying, growing weaker by the minute, was breaking his heart. And looking at the mother bear, seeing her distress, her helpless pacing, her desperate attempts to get closer to her baby, Mike realized this was one of those moments that define who we really are. When all the rules and safety protocols fade away, and we're left with just one simple choice between action and inaction, between helping and walking away. The stage was set for something none of them would ever forget. The mother bear's desperation was escalating by the minute, and it was terrifying to watch. This wasn't the calm, controlled behavior we'd observed earlier when she was simply protecting her cubs from what she perceived as human threats. This was pure maternal anguish, raw and primal, the kind of emotion that transcends species and speaks directly to every parent's worst nightmare. She would approach the road, get within 10 feet of where the crying was coming from, then something would spook her back toward the tree line. A car door slamming, someone's nervous laughter, the flash of a camera. Each time she retreated, her agitation grew more intense. She was pacing in tight circles now, making low, throaty sounds that sent chills down everyone's spine. The cub's crying from the culvert was becoming more intermittent, which somehow made it even more heartbreaking. Those brief moments of silence were the worst, when everyone held their breath, wondering if the little bear had given up, had succumbed to the cold and exhaustion. Then another weak cry would emerge from that dark concrete tunnel, and the mother bear would respond with sounds that could only be described as anguish. Mike was watching the tourists' reactions as much as he was watching the bears, and what he saw worried him deeply. About half the people had already left, either uncomfortable with the developing situation or simply unaware of how serious it was becoming. But those who remained were getting increasingly agitated themselves. Some were trying to film everything on their phones, getting closer to the action than was safe. Others were talking loudly about what should be done, their voices carrying across the snow and clearly disturbing the already stressed mother bear. A few people were actually arguing about whether they should try to help or call for authorities. "Someone needs to call the park rangers," one woman was saying, her voice sharp with anxiety. "They'll never get here in time." another tourist replied. "That baby's going to freeze to death." "Well, we can't just stand here and watch," came a third voice filled with frustration. But that's exactly what they were doing. Standing there, watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, everyone waiting for someone else to take action. The human tendency to diffuse responsibility in a crisis was playing out in real time, while precious minutes ticked away. The mother bear's behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable. She would charge toward the road, stop abruptly, rear up on her hind legs to survey the scene, then drop back down and pace frantically. Each false charge sent ripples of panic through the remaining tourists, some scrambling toward their cars, others frozen in place by indecision and fear. Mike could see the dangerous pattern developing. The longer this went on, the more desperate the mother bear would become, and desperate animals, especially mother bears, were capable of anything. If she decided that the humans were somehow responsible for her cub's predicament, or if her desperation overcame her natural fear of people, someone could get seriously hurt or killed. The weather was working against them too. The snow was falling harder now, big wet flakes that reduced visibility and made the road surface increasingly treacherous. The temperature was dropping steadily, and the wind was picking up, creating that bone-deep cold that saps strength and clarity of thought. From inside the culvert, the cubs' cries were getting weaker and more sporadic. Mike knew from his years of wildlife photography that young bears could succumb to hypothermia quickly when separated from their mother's warmth. The concrete tunnel would be like a refrigerator, drawing heat away from the small body faster than it could generate it. The mother bear seemed to sense this too. Her pacing was becoming more frantic, more erratic. She would approach the culvert opening, stick her massive head as close as she dared, then retreat when the human voices got too loud, or when someone moved too quickly. It was a heartbreaking dance of maternal instinct versus survival programming. Some of the remaining tourists were starting to panic themselves now. The combination of the weather, the growing darkness, the mother bear's increasingly aggressive behavior, and the weakening cries from the trapped cub was creating a pressure cooker of emotion and fear. "This is insane," one man was saying to his wife. "We need to get out of here before that bear decides we're the problem." "But what about the baby?" she replied, tears visible on her cheeks. "We can't just leave it to die." It was the fundamental human dilemma playing out in the wilderness of Yellowstone. The conflict between self-preservation and compassion, between safety and moral obligation. Everyone felt the pull to help, but no one knew how to help without making the situation worse. Mike was feeling that conflict more intensely than anyone. His experience with wildlife gave him perhaps the best understanding of what was happening, of what was at stake, and of how dangerous the situation was becoming. He could see the trajectory this was on, could predict how it would end if something didn't change soon. The mother bear was running out of options and running out of time. Her cub was weakening, and her own desperation was pushing her closer and closer to a point where instinct would override caution. If she decided to charge toward the culvert regardless of the human presence, people would scatter in panic, probably making noise and chaos that would only make things worse. And through it all, that weak crying continued to drift up from the darkness beneath the road, a sound that was breaking everyone's heart and testing every assumption they had about their own courage and compassion. The situation was reaching a tipping point, and Mike knew that someone was going to have to make a decision soon. The question was whether it would be the right decision, made with wisdom and courage, or the wrong decision, made in panic and fear. Time was running out for everyone involved. Mike stood at the edge of that snowy road, his mind racing through scenarios, each one more dangerous than the last. This wasn't like photographing wildlife from a safe distance or observing bear behavior through binoculars. This was life and death unfolding in real time, with no safety net and no second chances. The internal battle raging in his head was visible on his face. Years of wilderness experience had taught him the cardinal rule of wildlife encounters: never get between a mother and her baby. It was the kind of mistake that ended careers, ended lives, ended everything. But standing there, listening to that cub's weakening cries, watching the mother bear's increasing desperation, Mike was facing a choice that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with conscience. His photographer's eye was automatically calculating distances, angles, escape routes. The mother bear was about 30 yards away, pacing along the tree line. The culvert opening was maybe 10 feet from where he stood. If he approached the trapped cub, he'd be completely exposed, completely vulnerable, with nowhere to run if the mother decided he was a threat. But it wasn't just his own safety he was weighing. There were still a dozen tourists scattered around the scene, some in their cars with engines running, others standing in small groups, all of them potential casualties if this situation exploded into chaos. If he made the wrong move, if he triggered the mother bear's protective instincts in the wrong way, people could die. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Mike had never asked to be the expert in this situation, never wanted to be the one person everyone was looking to for answers. But his reputation, his experience, his calm presence during the earlier encounter had made him the unofficial leader, and now everyone was waiting to see what he would do. The cub's crying was becoming more intermittent, and each pause was agony. During those silent moments, Mike could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the whispered conversations of the tourists, could hear the mother bear's anxious huffing as she paced back and forth along the forest edge. "What do you think he's going to do?" Someone whispered behind him. "He has to do something," came the reply. "That baby's not going to make it much longer." The pressure was building from all sides. The tourists wanted action. The mother bear was becoming increasingly unpredictable. The weather was deteriorating, and the cub was running out of time. Mike felt like he was standing at the center of a tightening spiral, with every passing minute making the situation more dangerous and more desperate. He thought about his own family, about the risks he'd taken over the years in pursuit of the perfect wildlife photograph. He'd always been careful, always calculated, always had an exit strategy. But this wasn't about getting a great shot or documenting animal behavior. This was about something much more fundamental, much more human. The mother bear had stopped pacing and was now standing at the very edge of the road, closer than she'd been since the crisis began. Her massive head was tilted toward the culvert, listening to her cub's weak cries. The anguish in her posture was unmistakable, heartbreaking, impossible to ignore. Mike could see the exact moment when she was wrestling with the same impossible choice he was facing. Every instinct was telling her to go to her baby, but the presence of humans was holding her back. She was trapped between fear and love, between survival programming and maternal devotion. The tourists were getting more agitated too. The combination of the weather, the darkness, and the emotional intensity of the situation was wearing on everyone's nerves. Some people were starting to argue about what should be done, their voices carrying across the snow and clearly disturbing the already stressed mother bear. "Someone needs to call 911, one person was saying. "And tell them what? That there's a bear cub stuck in a culvert? They'll tell us to wait for wildlife officials," came the frustrated reply. "Well, we can't just let it die." The arguments were getting louder, more heated, adding another layer of chaos to an already volatile situation. Mike could see how this was affecting the mother bear, how the human voices were pushing her closer to a breaking point. If you were in Mike's place, with a scared cub, an angry mother bear, and dozens of terrified people, what would you do? Tell us in the comments below. I'm curious to know how you'd react in a moment like this when every choice seems wrong but doing nothing isn't an option. The wind was picking up now, driving the snow horizontally across the road and making visibility even worse. The temperature was dropping steadily, and Mike knew that time was becoming as much an enemy as the dangerous circumstances they were facing. The cub's cries were noticeably weaker now, coming in shorter bursts with longer silences between them. Each time the crying stopped, Mike felt his heart skip a beat, wondering if this was the end, if they were about to become witnesses to a tragedy they could have prevented. The mother bear seemed to sense her baby's weakening condition too. Her agitation was reaching a fever pitch, her pacing becoming more erratic, her vocalizations more urgent and desperate. She was running out of patience, running out of hope, running out of reasons to stay away from her baby. Mike realized that the decision was being made for him. If he didn't act soon, the mother bear would. And when she did, when maternal instinct finally overcame caution, the situation would spiral completely out of control. People would panic, scatter, make noise and chaos that would only make everything worse. The moment of truth was approaching fast, and Mike could feel the weight of every eye on him, every expectation, every hope that somehow he would know what to do, that somehow he would have the courage to do it. The next few minutes would define not just this rescue attempt, but how Mike saw himself for the rest of his life. Something shifted in Mike's expression, a subtle change that everyone around him seemed to sense simultaneously. The internal debate that had been raging in his mind reached its conclusion in a single, crystallizing moment. He wasn't thinking about protocols anymore, wasn't calculating odds or considering consequences. He was thinking about that weak, desperate crying coming from the darkness beneath the road. The decision came not from his head, but from somewhere deeper, from that part of human nature that compels us to act when faced with suffering, regardless of personal risk. Mike had spent his entire career observing wildlife, maintaining the careful distance that kept both animals and humans safe. But some moments transcend professional boundaries. Some situations demand that we become more than just observers. "Everyone needs to get back to their cars," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. There was something in his tone that made people listen, something that cut through all the nervous chatter and uncertainty. "Start your engines, but don't leave, just be ready." The authority in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. This was someone taking charge in a crisis, someone who had made a decision and was now committed to seeing it through, regardless of the consequences. "What are you going to do?" asked one of the tourists, though the answer was already becoming clear. Mike didn't respond immediately. He was studying the mother bear's position, timing her pacing pattern, calculating how much time he might have before she decided to approach the culvert herself. He was also listening to the cub's cries, trying to gauge how much strength the little bear had left. The tactical part of his mind was working overtime now, not second-guessing his decision but figuring out how to execute it with the best possible chance of success. The mother bear seemed to be following a rough pattern in her movements, spending about 30 seconds at the far end of her pacing route before turning back toward the road. That might give him enough time to reach the culvert, assess the situation, and hopefully begin the rescue. "I'm going to get that cub out," Mike said simply, his words carrying across the snowy scene like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple effect was immediate. Some people gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. A few started to protest. "That's suicide," someone called out. "That mother bear will kill you." Mike understood their fear, understood their logic. Under normal circumstances, they would be absolutely right. Approaching a trapped cub with its mother nearby violated every rule of wildlife safety ever written. But these weren't normal circumstances, and sometimes the rules had to be weighed against something more important. He began walking slowly toward the culvert opening, his movements deliberate and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Every step took him further from safety, further from the possibility of escape if things went wrong. Behind him, he could hear car doors slamming, engines revving, the sounds of people preparing for the worst. The mother bear noticed his approach immediately. Her pacing stopped. Her massive head turned toward him, and for a moment the entire scene held its breath. This was the critical moment, when she would decide whether Mike was another threat to be driven away or something else entirely. Mike's approach was unlike anything the bear had encountered. He wasn't running, wasn't making sudden movements, wasn't showing the fear or aggression that typically characterized human behavior in her experience. Instead, he moved with a quiet confidence, a purposefulness that seemed to communicate something different. He was talking, not to the tourist behind him, but to the bear herself, his voice low and steady, designed to be calming rather than threatening. The words didn't matter. Bears don't understand human language. But tone mattered, intention mattered, and somehow his steady approach seemed to register as something other than a threat. "It's okay, Mama," he was saying softly. "I know you want to help your baby. I want to help too. We both want the same thing here." The mother bear was watching him intently now, her body tense, but not in the aggressive posture they'd seen earlier. She seemed to be evaluating this strange human who was approaching her cub, but showing none of the behaviors she associated with danger. Mike reached the edge of the culvert and knelt down, peering into the dark concrete tunnel. The sight that greeted him was both heartbreaking and terrifying. About 6 feet into the culvert, barely visible in the shadows, was a small bear cub, maybe 3 months old, covered in snow and ice, shivering uncontrollably. The cub was stuck, that much was clear. Its back legs seemed to be caught in some kind of debris or ice formation, and its front paws were slipping on the smooth concrete as it tried desperately to climb out. The little bear looked up at Mike with eyes that held no fear, only exhaustion and the kind of desperate hope that transcends species. "Hey there, little one," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Let's get you out of there." The mother bear had moved closer, close enough that Mike could hear her breathing, could sense her massive presence just yards away. This was the moment of ultimate vulnerability, when he would have to reach into that culvert, turn his back on an 800-pound predator, and trust that somehow she understood his intentions. Behind him, the tourists were watching in complete silence now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Some were crying, some were praying. All of them were hoping that Mike's incredible act of courage would somehow end in miracle rather than tragedy. The cub made another weak cry, and the sound galvanized Mike into action. He couldn't reach the trapped bear from the culvert opening. He was going to have to climb partway inside into that dark, confined space where escape would be impossible if the mother decided he was a threat. Taking a deep breath, Mike began to lower himself into the culvert, his headlamp illuminating the scared, shivering cub just out of reach. This was the point of no return, the moment when courage either carried him forward to success or led him to disaster. Every eye was on him, every heart was pounding, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, a baby bear was waiting for a miracle. The inside of the culvert was even colder than Mike had expected, the concrete walls drawing heat from his body as he crawled deeper into the tunnel. His headlamp beam illuminated the terrified cub, and up close the little bear's condition was worse than he'd feared. Its fur was matted with ice, its tiny body shaking uncontrollably, and its back legs were definitely caught in a tangle of frozen debris and wire mesh. Mike's hands were already numb from the cold, but he forced himself to move slowly, deliberately, speaking in soft, reassuring tones to the frightened cub. Behind him, he could hear the mother bear's heavy breathing, could sense her massive presence at the culvert entrance, but he couldn't look back. He had to trust that she would continue to recognize him as help rather than threat. "Easy, baby," he whispered to the cub, reaching out slowly with one hand. "I'm going to get you free, but you need to stay calm for me." The cub's response broke his heart and filled him with hope simultaneously. Instead of trying to bite or scratch, the little bear actually moved toward Mike's outstretched hand, as if somehow understanding that this strange creature meant help, meant rescue, meant a chance to return to Mama. Working in the cramped, freezing space, Mike began carefully examining how the cub was trapped. Its back legs were caught in what appeared to be old construction mesh, probably left over from when the culvert was installed years ago. The wire had gotten twisted around the cub's legs when it fell, and the more the little bear had struggled, the tighter the trap had become. Mike's fingers were so cold they were barely functional, but he forced them to work, carefully unwinding the wire mesh from around the cub's legs. Each movement had to be precise. One wrong twist could injure the already traumatized baby bear, and any sudden movement might trigger the mother bear's protective instincts. "Almost got it," Mike murmured, as much to himself as to the cub. "Just a little more, sweetheart." The cub was surprisingly calm now, as if sensing that rescue was finally at hand. Its breathing was still labored from exhaustion and cold, but it had stopped struggling, stopped crying, and was actually nuzzling against Mike's hand as he worked to free its trapped legs. Behind him, Mike could hear the mother bear moving closer to the culvert entrance. Not aggressively, but with the careful attention of a parent monitoring a critical situation. Occasionally, she would make soft huffing sounds, and the cub would respond with tiny squeaks, a conversation between mother and baby that needed no translation. "There we go," Mike breathed, as the last piece of wire mesh came free. The cub's legs were scraped and bruised but didn't appear to be seriously injured. Now came the most dangerous part, getting both of them out of the culvert safely. Mike carefully gathered the exhausted cub against his chest, feeling the little bear's heart beating rapidly against his ribs. The cub was heavier than he'd expected, maybe 25 pounds of solid muscle and fur, but it nestled against him with complete trust, instinctively seeking warmth and safety. The backward crawl out of the culvert was the longest 30 seconds of Mike's life. With the cub in his arms, he had to move awkwardly, unable to see where he was going, trusting that the mother bear would continue to allow this unprecedented cooperation between human and bear. When Mike's feet finally emerged from the culvert, and he could stand upright again, the scene that greeted him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The mother bear was standing just 10 feet away, closer than she'd been to any human during this entire ordeal, her eyes fixed not on Mike but on the bundle of fur in his arms. For a moment that lasted forever, the three of them stood in the falling snow, a wild grizzly bear, a human wildlife photographer, and a rescued cub that represented the bridge between two worlds. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of the cub's breathing and the whisper of snow falling around them. Then Mike did something that went against every instinct, every rule, every piece of advice he'd ever received about wildlife encounters. He knelt down and gently placed the cub on the snow-covered ground, then slowly backed away, giving the mother bear space to reclaim her baby. The reunion that followed was pure magic. The mother bear approached her cub with movements so gentle they seemed impossible for such a massive creature. She nuzzled the little bear, licked its face, made soft rumbling sounds that could only be described as relief and love made audible. The cub, despite its exhaustion, immediately began nursing, seeking the warmth and security that only its mother could provide. The little bear's tail wagged with joy, and it made contented squeaking sounds that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. If this moment touched your heart even half as much as it did ours, show your support by giving this video a like right now. Every like helps us bring more stories like this to the world, stories that remind us of the incredible connections possible between humans and wildlife. The tourists who had remained throughout this ordeal were crying openly now, some applauding softly, others simply standing in stunned silence at what they'd just witnessed. Mike himself was shaking, not just from the cold but from the emotional intensity of what had just happened. The mother bear looked up at Mike once during that reunion, and for just a moment, their eyes met across the species divide. What passed between them in that glance was beyond words, beyond explanation. It was recognition, gratitude, and perhaps most remarkably, a kind of mutual respect that transcended every boundary that normally existed between human and wild animal. As the bear family began to move away from the road, the cub walking unsteadily but determinedly beside its mother, everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a moment that proved the power of compassion to bridge any gap, overcome any fear, and create connections that seemed impossible. The snow was still falling, the wind was still cold, but somehow the world felt warmer, more hopeful, more filled with possibility than it had just an hour before. Mike stood in the middle of that snow-covered road, watching the bear family disappear into the pine forest, and for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to truly feel the magnitude of what had just happened. His hands were still shaking, not just from the cold but from an adrenaline crash that left him feeling simultaneously exhausted and more alive than he'd felt in years. The silence that followed the bear's departure was profound. Even the tourists who had been talking nervously throughout the crisis seemed to understand that words would somehow diminish what they'd just witnessed. There was something sacred about the moment, something that demanded quiet respect and internal processing. Mike's photographer instincts had been completely dormant during the rescue. He hadn't thought once about capturing the moment, hadn't considered the incredible footage this would have made, hadn't even remembered that he had cameras with him. In that culvert, reaching for that trapped cub, he hadn't been a wildlife photographer or content creator or social media personality. He'd simply been a human being responding to another living creature in need. The realization of what he'd risked, what could have gone wrong, was starting to hit him now. The mother bear could have attacked at any moment. The cub could have panicked and bitten him. He could have gotten stuck in the culvert himself. Any number of things could have turned this rescue into a tragedy, and the weight of those possibilities was almost overwhelming. But looking at the faces around him, at the tourists who were approaching him with expressions of awe and gratitude, Mike realized that sometimes the greatest risks led to the most meaningful rewards. The elderly woman who had been crying during the rescue reached out and took his hands in hers, squeezing them gently without saying a word. Her husband nodded respectfully, the kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who have shared something profound. "I've never seen anything like that in my life," whispered a young father who had been holding his daughter throughout the ordeal. "The way she trusted you, the way she let you help her baby. It was like she knew you were trying to help." A couple from Germany approached with tears in their eyes, struggling to find English words adequate to express what they'd felt watching the rescue unfold. Their broken sentences and emotional gestures communicated more than perfect language ever could have. They had witnessed something that transcended cultural boundaries, something universally human and deeply moving. Mike was feeling overwhelmed by the attention, by the gratitude, by the emotional intensity of everyone's reactions. He'd acted on instinct, done what felt right in the moment, and somehow that simple choice had created ripples that were touching everyone present in profound ways. That's when they heard the vehicles approaching from both directions. Park rangers, finally arriving on the scene, their trucks cutting through the snow with emergency lights flashing. Mike felt a moment of anxiety, wondering if he was about to face consequences for his unconventional rescue methods, for violating every protocol about human-wildlife interactions. The lead ranger stepped out of his truck and surveyed the scene, the scattered cars, the emotional tourists, the tracks in the snow that told the story of what had happened. His experienced eyes took in the details quickly, and when he approached Mike, his expression was unreadable. "You're the one who went into the culvert?" the ranger asked, his tone neutral but not hostile. "Yes, sir," Mike replied, bracing himself for the lecture about dangerous and irresponsible behavior that he was sure was coming. Instead, the ranger extended his hand. "Tom Bradley, 23 years with the Park Service. In all my time here, I've never seen anything like what these folks are describing. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing anyone's ever done in this park. And honestly, I'm leaning toward brave." The handshake was firm, respectful, carrying the weight of professional recognition from someone who truly understood the risks and the stakes involved. Other rangers were spreading out, examining the culvert, taking photos, documenting the scene. But their leader's focus remained on Mike. "The mother bear," Tom continued. "She's part of a family we've been monitoring for 3 years. Lost 2 cubs to various causes last season. If she'd lost this one too." He paused, looking toward the forest where the bears had disappeared. "You probably saved more than just that cub today. You probably saved her from a grief that would have changed her forever." The emotional weight of that statement settled over everyone present. This hadn't just been about rescuing a trapped animal. It had been about preserving a family, maintaining the delicate balance that kept this wild ecosystem functioning as it should. Mike felt a profound sense of completion, of having been exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right moment. The cold, the fear, the risk, the overwhelming responsibility, all of it had led to this moment of recognition that some actions transcend personal safety and become part of something much larger than ourselves. The crowd of tourists was beginning to disperse now, people returning to their cars with stories they would tell for the rest of their lives. But the connections formed in those intense minutes would linger. The shared experience of witnessing extraordinary courage and compassion, creating bonds that would endure long after the snow melted and spring returned to Yellowstone. As the park rangers finished their documentation and the last of the tourist cars pulled away, Mike found himself alone on that stretch of road where everything had changed. The snow was still falling, but gentler now, creating a peaceful silence that invited reflection on the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. Standing there in the growing darkness, Mike tried to process what had driven him to take such an incredible risk. Throughout his career, he'd prided himself on being the responsible wildlife photographer, the one who maintained proper distances, who never interfered with natural processes, who understood that nature could be cruel and that human intervention often did more harm than good. But this had been different. This hadn't been about natural predation or seasonal hardship or any of the harsh realities that were simply part of wilderness life. This had been about an accident, a random misfortune that had trapped an innocent creature in a situation it could never have escaped on its own. Sometimes, Mike realized, the most natural thing a human can do is act with compassion when compassion is needed most. The memory of that moment in the culvert, when the exhausted cub had nuzzled against his hand with complete trust, would stay with him forever. In that dark, cold space beneath the road, all the barriers between species had dissolved. There had been no predator and prey, no wild and domestic, no animal and human. There had simply been two living beings, one in desperate need and one capable of providing help. The mother bear's reaction had been the most remarkable part of the entire experience. Her willingness to allow a human to approach her trapped cub went against everything scientists understood about bear behavior. But perhaps, Mike thought, there were forms of communication that went deeper than instinct, deeper than programming, deeper than the evolutionary divisions that normally kept species apart. He thought about the tourists who had witnessed the rescue, about how the experience had affected each of them differently but profoundly. Some had been moved to tears, others to silence, but all had been changed by seeing compassion triumph over fear, courage overcome impossible odds, and love transcend the boundaries that normally separated the human and natural worlds. The young father with his daughter had perhaps captured it best when he'd said that witnessing the rescue had restored his faith in the possibility of good outcomes, even in situations that seemed hopeless. In a world that often seemed dominated by bad news and insurmountable problems, seeing one person choose courage over safety had reminded everyone present that individual actions still mattered, still had the power to change outcomes. Mike's hands were finally warming up in his gloves, but he could still feel the memory of that cub's fur against his palms, could still hear the tiny squeaking sounds it had made when reunited with its mother. Those sensory memories would become treasures, reminders of a day when he had stepped outside his comfort zone and discovered reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed. The philosophical implications of the rescue were equally profound. For years, Mike had documented the natural world as an observer, maintaining the emotional distance that professional wildlife photographers cultivate to avoid becoming too attached to their subjects. But today had shattered that professional detachment, revealing that sometimes the most important moments happened not when you were behind a camera, but when you put the camera down and simply acted as a human being. The park ranger's words kept echoing in his mind. You probably saved more than just that cub today. The ripple effects of compassionate action extended far beyond the immediate rescue. They influenced every person who witnessed them, every person who heard the story, every person who was reminded that kindness and courage still existed in the world. Where are you watching this story from? Tell us below. It's incredible how far these stories of connection and courage can reach, how they can inspire people in cities and towns and countries far from the wilderness where they began. Mike realized that this rescue would become more than just a personal memory. It would become a story that people shared, a reminder that the bonds between all living things were stronger than the forces that seemed to divide them. In a world that often felt fragmented and disconnected, moments like this one served as powerful reminders of our fundamental interconnectedness. The snow crunched under his boots as he finally walked back toward his vehicle, but Mike knew he was leaving that road as a different person than he'd been when he arrived. He'd discovered something about himself, something about the capacity for courage that lies dormant in all of us until circumstances call it forth. The wilderness of Yellowstone would continue its ancient rhythms, seasons changing, animals living and dying according to patterns established long before humans arrived. But today, for one brief moment, those patterns had been interrupted by an act of interspecies compassion that proved love and courage were forces of nature too. 3 days later, Mike found himself driving back to that same stretch of road, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The snow had stopped, the weather had cleared, and the late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the landscape that had been the stage for such an extraordinary drama. He parked in almost the exact same spot where the crisis had unfolded, and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The culvert was still there, of course, but now it seemed like just an ordinary piece of infrastructure rather than the site of a life-changing rescue. The only evidence of what had happened were some tire tracks in the snow and a few footprints that would be gone with the next snowfall. Mike was about to get back in his truck when movement caught his eye along the tree line. 3 dark shapes were moving through the forest, and even at a distance he recognized them immediately. The mother bear and her 2 cubs were foraging in a small clearing about 100 yards from the road, completely at peace, completely unaware that their human observer was watching from afar. Through his binoculars, Mike could see that the rescued cub was moving normally, showing no signs of lasting injury from its ordeal in the culvert. It was playing with its sibling, tumbling in the snow, exhibiting all the joyful energy that young bears were meant to have. The mother was relaxed, alert, but not anxious, watching her babies with the contented attention of a parent whose world was complete once again. For several minutes, Mike simply watched this perfect scene of family contentment, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with photography or documentation. This was the real reward for the risk he'd taken, the proof that his moment of courage had led to exactly the outcome everyone had hoped for. As if sensing his presence, the mother bear looked up toward the road. Even at that distance, Mike felt a moment of recognition pass between them, an acknowledgement of their shared experience that transcended the barriers between species. She held his gaze for just a few seconds, then returned her attention to her cubs, secure in the knowledge that this particular human represented no threat to her family's peace. The story of the rescue had already begun to spread beyond that snowy road in Yellowstone. The tourists who had witnessed it were sharing their videos and photos on social media, telling friends and family about the incredible act of courage they'd seen. The park rangers were talking about it at ranger stations throughout the park. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and wildlife organizations were using it as an example of positive human-wildlife interaction. But for Mike, watching this peaceful family scene, the real significance of the rescue had nothing to do with public recognition or viral videos. It was about the simple fact that love and courage had triumphed over fear and inaction. It was about the proof that in a world that often seemed divided between human and natural realms, cooperation and compassion were still possible. The cubs were growing bolder in their play now, venturing further from their mother but always returning to her reassuring presence. Mike realized he was witnessing the kind of normal, healthy development that would have been impossible if the rescue had failed. The traumatized cub was learning to trust the world again, to play and explore and grow into the wild bear it was meant to become. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the snow, Mike knew it was time to leave. This family deserved their privacy, their chance to live wild and free without human interference. His role in their story was complete, his moment of intersection with their lives a beautiful anomaly that had served its purpose. Walking back to his truck, Mike reflected on how the rescue had changed not just that bear family, but everyone who had been part of it. The tourists had returned home with a story that would inspire others. The park rangers had been reminded of why they chose careers in wildlife protection, and Mike himself had discovered reserves of courage and compassion he hadn't known he possessed. The road stretched ahead, leading back toward civilization, but Mike knew he was carrying something precious with him. The memory of that tiny cub's trust, the mother bear's acceptance of his help, the moment when fear gave way to love and courage, overcame impossible odds. These memories would become part of who he was, shaping future decisions and inspiring future acts of kindness. In a world that often felt dominated by division and conflict, the rescue stood as proof that cooperation and compassion were still possible. That sometimes, when faced with suffering, the most natural human response was simply to help, regardless of the risks or the rules or the rational arguments against action. The bear family was safe. The story would continue to inspire others, and somewhere in the wilderness of Yellowstone, love had triumphed over fear once again. As Mike's truck disappeared down that mountain road, carrying with it the memory of one of the most extraordinary human-wildlife encounters ever documented, we're left with something that goes far beyond a simple rescue story. What you've just witnessed represents everything we believe in, everything we strive to capture and share with this incredible community that's growing around these stories of connection, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between all living things. This isn't just about wildlife photography or documenting nature. This is about those rare, precious moments when the barriers between species dissolve completely, when fear gives way to trust, when one being's willingness to risk everything for another creates ripples that spread far beyond the original act of courage. These are the stories that remind us who we can be at our very best, who we are when we strip away everything except our most fundamental humanity. Mike's decision to crawl into that freezing culvert, To risk his life for a creature that couldn't thank him or even understand what he was doing represents something that our world desperately needs more of. In an age when it's easy to feel disconnected, when it's tempting to believe that individual actions don't matter, stories like this prove that one person's courage can change everything. The mother bear's willingness to trust a human with her most precious possession, her baby's life, challenges everything we think we know about the relationships between wild animals and people. That moment of interspecies cooperation, that recognition that passed between Mike and that 800-pound predator, suggests possibilities for harmony that most of us never imagined could exist. Every person who witnessed that rescue was changed by it. The tourists who watched in terrified silence as Mike disappeared into that culvert, who held their breath as he emerged with that exhausted cub, who cried tears of joy as they watched the reunion between mother and baby. They all went home with stories that will be told for generations. Stories that will inspire others to believe in the power of compassion, to overcome impossible odds. The park rangers who arrived to find evidence of an act of courage that went against every protocol they'd ever learned, but that resulted in the kind of outcome they'd dedicated their careers to achieving. They were reminded that sometimes the most important conservation work happens not in offices or through legislation, but in moments of individual choice, when one person decides that life and love matter more than safety and rules. But perhaps most importantly, Mike himself was transformed by what happened on that snowy road. A man who had spent his career maintaining careful distances, observing rather than interfering, discovered that his most meaningful moment as a wildlife photographer came when he put down his camera and simply acted as a human being responding to another creature in need. The ripple effects of that rescue are still spreading. Every person who hears this story is reminded that courage is contagious, that compassion is a choice we can make every day, that the bonds between all living things are stronger than the forces that seem to divide us. In a world that often feels fragmented and hostile, stories like this serve as beacons of hope, proof that love and cooperation are still possible. If you felt the rush of adrenaline watching Mike approach that mother bear, if you've held your breath as he disappeared into that dark culvert, if you felt your heart break at the sound of that cub's desperate crying and soar with joy at the moment of reunion, then you understand what we're trying to build here. This community isn't just about watching amazing wildlife encounters, it's about celebrating the moments when humanity rises to meet its highest potential. These stories matter because they change us. They remind us that we're capable of more courage than we think, more compassion than we often show, more connection with the natural world than our daily lives usually allow us to remember. Every video we share is chosen not just for its dramatic content, but for its power to inspire, to heal, to reconnect us with the parts of ourselves that sometimes get lost in the complexity of modern life. The story of Mike and the bear cub will be told and retold, shared and reshared, inspiring people in ways we can't even predict. Somewhere, a child will hear this story and decide to dedicate their life to wildlife conservation. Somewhere, an adult will remember Mike's courage the next time they're faced with a choice between safety and compassion. Somewhere, someone who feels disconnected from nature will be reminded that we're all part of the same living world. If you felt the power of this story, if you've been moved by this incredible demonstration of what becomes possible when we choose love over fear, this is your moment to join us. Click that subscribe button right now and become part of a community that believes in the transformative power of these connections between humans and wildlife. Don't leave yet, because the next story appearing on your screen is one you absolutely don't want to miss. It's about a moment that pushes the boundaries of everything you think you know about animal intelligence, about the capacity for gratitude in the wild world, about the mysterious ways that kindness creates bonds that transcend every barrier we thought was permanent. Your next journey into the heart of the wild is waiting for you. Are you ready to discover what happens when the impossible becomes inevitable? When the unbelievable becomes undeniably real? Click play, and let's continue this incredible adventure together.